Hi, everyone. I'm Elaine Quijano. It's good to be with you. Thanks for joining us. Celebrations and demonstrations are taking place across the country to commemorate Juneteenth. The date marks the end of slavery in the U.S. It comes after weeks of protests following the deaths of several Black men and women at the hands of police. Protests are expected this weekend. That includes in Tulsa, Oklahoma, where President Trump is set to hold his first campaign rally since the coronavirus pandemic began. Skylar Henry has the latest.
Demonstrators gathered across the country and here in the nation's capital to celebrate Juneteenth.
It's a part of our history, so I encourage celebrating everything about Black history.
No peace. This year's commemoration has a special meaning. Weeks of protests sparked by racially charged killings of several African Americans by police or civilians has raised the awareness of the annual June 19th memorial.
This is my son, who's 20 years old, and I hate that I have to worry about him every single day. I think this protest have been very positive.
Professional athletes from the Washington Wizards and Mystics basketball teams led a march to the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial, where they read the names of some of those killed.
George Floyd.
The Trump administration released a statement commemorating the date. The White House press secretary also defended President Trump from backlash over a Wall Street Journal interview this week, during which the president said he made Juneteenth famous.
His presidents routinely commemorated Juneteenth. He did not just learn about Juneteenth this week. That's simply not true. And as to Juneteenth, there were a lot of people who didn't know what Juneteenth was.
The president rescheduled a planned campaign rally in Tulsa, Oklahoma, from Juneteenth to Saturday, after widespread outcries over the original date. Skylar Henry, CBS News, Washington.
Major Garrett and Catherine Herridge join me now. Major is CBS News Chief Washington Correspondent, and Catherine is CBS News Senior Investigative Correspondent. Welcome. It is good to see you both again. Major, let me start with you. In an interview last week, President Trump said he made Juneteenth, quote, very famous by initially scheduling his rally for today. We heard what Kayleigh McEnany said there in the piece from Skylar, but what else is the White House saying regarding this controversy?
Well, leave it to the president to deeply personalize something that has been part of African Americans' history in this country for a long time. It's been a state holiday, for example, in the state of Texas since 1980. And whatever the president said about Juneteenth before, he did not focus nearly as much attention on this day of commemoration and celebration as he did by misscheduling his Tulsa rally for Juneteenth. That's what the White House and the campaign said. It's probably a bad idea. Let's move it. And the president said on Twitter, after so many people raised all these issues with me, I listened to them and moved it. Tim Scott, the only African-American Republican in the Senate and a frequent advisor to the president, said on Face the Nation earlier this week, President and his team didn't know anything about it. Reince Priebus, the president's first chief of staff, former RNC chair, and CBS contributor, told me on the evening news, weekend news last Saturday, President and his team didn't know anything about it. They have to live and learn. So what the White House and the campaign are trying to do is say, well, there's something that's good that's come of this. Well, possibly, but it started with either ignorance or insensitivity or a combination of both about this time, that place, and the convergence of a Trump campaign rally.
Well, the event site, the BOK Center, requested the Trump campaign provide a social distancing plan. We know the campaign will hand out masks, but they are not mandatory. Major, how else is the Trump campaign responding to concerns about holding events while the coronavirus continues to spread?
Well, the chief reaction from the Trump campaign and the White House is, wait a minute. What is all this concern, and they might describe it as hyperventilating in media circles, about a rally in Tulsa indoors when there was no media concern expressed about street protests where tens of thousands gathered and people were close to each other, and that was a place where you could possibly spread the virus. They consider the scrutiny of the Tulsa rally to be disproportionate and reflective, they assert, of some kind of bias, that there is something pernicious about Trump supporters gathering to express their political beliefs and their political outcry in this campaign season, as opposed to street protesters protesting police brutality, police violence, and advocating for police reform. The Trump campaign says they're all the same, and they should be treated the same with the same level of respect and the same deference for individuals who attend those events to decide for themselves what their level of risk is and how they're going to deal with that risk. And the Trump campaign says we allow people to come in, we will give them the things that they can use to protect themselves, masks, hand sanitizer, but we're not going to socially distance, and it's up to them to decide what their risk level is and what their comfort level is. One notable difference, and I know you know this, Elaine, and the audience may as well, nobody at the protest about police brutality were asked to sign a waiver holding organizers harmless if they contracted the virus. To attend the Tulsa rally on behalf of the Trump campaign, you have to.
It is an important point. I also want to ask about John Bolton. Catherine, lawyers for the former National Security Advisor said, and the Justice Department were in court Friday, and the government is suing to prevent the release of John Bolton's new book. What arguments is each side making?
Well, Elaine, this hearing lasted about 2 hours, and if there was one phrase that we heard more than anything else is that the horse has left the barn, and that's a way of saying that really the damage is already done, the book is already out, we have it, other reporters have it, and the question for the court is what remedy or action could they take at this point that would satisfy the government? And the government argued that the reason the horse is out of the barn is it's because John Bolton released it, and they said he moved forward with the publication of his book without a written authorization, which was required because of the non-disclosure agreements he signed in order to get access to highly classified information. And they said this is really a mess for John Bolton to clean up, not for the government. And they said the remedy was to limit distribution of the books. So, for example, no e-books, no audio books, and thousands of copies are at distributors, so hold them so that they don't get to booksellers. Now, Bolton's legal team argued that he went through the review process in good faith, and they never had a hint that there was this highly classified information or alleged highly classified information in the manuscript, something called SCI, which is sensitive compartmented information, and it has that name because of the sources and methods used to collect it, until this second review, and his lawyers called it a, quote, political review, and insinuated it was designed to classify information after the fact and frustrate the publication of John Bolton's memoirs. And they said any kind of injunction imposed by the court would be a glancing blow against the First Amendment, Elaine.
So, Catherine, I wonder if anything we heard from the Justice Department with their arguments today suggests possible criminal charges against Bolton. Is there anything at all that we heard that points to what we might potentially see?
Well, the hearing in many ways was an education in intelligence and the classification process, Elaine. They talked about something called SCI, so that's sensitive compartmented information. It's considered kind of the crown jewels of intelligence because it comes from highly sensitive and fragile collection methods and sources. So human spies, for example, or telephone intercepts. And what the government said today is that there are at least 3 examples of highly classified information that are still in the manuscript, and they were classified at that level before this second review took place. And I think this is laying the foundation for a possible prosecution on the unauthorized disclosure of classified information if, and it's a big if, the Justice Department were to go down that route.
It is a big if, but as you point out, I mean, practically speaking, the book is already in the public domain. You talked about, you know, having those copies that are still in boxes somewhere held and not having ebooks, et cetera. But can the official release of this book, Catherine, be stopped at this point?
Well, where we are right now is that the judge was going to have a closed session, Elaine, and he was going to review these declarations that come from senior members of the U.S. intelligence community that speak to what they say is highly classified information that is contained in the manuscript. And the judge said that he would review those, not because he can make a decision on classification, but he said he would not have blind deference to the government on this issue, but some deference. And he said he would either rule from the bench or he would issue a written order to all of the parties. So the expectation, though he didn't put a timeline on it, is that he would make some kind of decision that would affect how the book is released sometime before Tuesday.
Interesting. Major, I want to turn to a topic that we discussed briefly yesterday, the Supreme Court. White House Press Secretary Kayleigh McEnany said Friday that the administration will be relitigating its challenge to DACA. Now, the president blasted the Supreme Court's decision and said he will soon be releasing a list of conservative judicial nominees. Now, I know in your excellent book, Major, Mr. Trump's Wild Ride, you wrote about the president's fixation, you called it, with putting that list together. So what are you seeing play out right now? It's been really interesting to watch the president's Twitter feed in the wake of that decision.
Right. The president's frustrated this week with two decisions from the Supreme Court. And those decisions from the eyes of the White House and conservatives rankle because they appear to them to be acts of judicial activism, going beyond the legislative intent of Congress, as federal law is currently drafted, or ignoring existing law in the case of the DACA decision, deferred adjudication for childhood arrivals, by not enforcing what they would argue is the clear intent of underlying immigration law. So in both cases, conservatives argue the court overstepped its limits and did so to injure the president's agenda, which is, from their perspective, ratified by the vote in the 2016 election. Therefore, the president says we need more conservatives on the Supreme Court. This is a bit of a sticky argument for him because he has two on the bench already. And one of them, Neil Gorsuch, wrote the case decision that said the Civil Rights Act of the early 1960s applies to those who are transgender, gay, and lesbian. And you can't fire them. And that's now part of the Supreme Court writ, law of the land. The president's not pleased with that, or DACA, which was authored by Chief Justice John Roberts. So the president has identified this issue in 2016. It was a decisive factor for at least 20, maybe 25% of Republican voters who said that and the future of the court was one of the things that was most important, if not the most important factor in their vote for President Trump. But he's got a court that he has said up until now is as he wants it and reflects his perspective. Now he doesn't like two decisions. Where does that leave him? Well, it leaves him saying, well, I'll get more conservative justices on the court. There is one fundamental difference between now and then, meaning 2016, Elaine. Democratic voters have become sensitized to this issue in a way that they simply were not in 2016, and conservative and Republican-aligned voters most definitely were. And those voters, democratically aligned voters, see the future of the court just as potently as an issue as Republicans and conservatives do now. This will be litigated in the election of this November. And there will be a sizable number of Democratic voters who will, I guarantee you, tell exit pollsters that the future of the Supreme Court was very much on their minds. So this is not the net advantage issue. It doesn't appear to be that it was for then-candidate Trump in 2016.
Finally, Major, you spoke with Joe Biden's senior advisor, Simone Sanders, for this week's episode of The Takeout. She said Arizona, Texas, and Georgia are in play for the campaign in November. What does she attribute that to?
Well, that's an example of sort of leading the witness a little bit, because I asked her a question. I said, one of the hazards in politics, as in military strategy, is to fight the last war. And I said, if you are fighting the last war in 2020, you're fighting only over Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan. Is that going to be the Biden strategy? Or are you going to fight over a new battlefield, Texas, Georgia, and Arizona? She said, well, we're going to do both. But she said all three of those latter states, historically Republican, are in play and will be competitive, and Democrats do believe that. And she said there will be an effort in the Biden campaign not only to re-win Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan, but to compete and compete aggressively in Arizona, Texas, and Georgia. And if you're going to identify one of those three where it's clear Democrats are going to fight aggressively and have the wherewithal to do so, it's Arizona, where they have a Senate candidate that's running ahead of the Republican incumbent currently. But Georgia and Texas are close behind. And the one thing I would say about the Biden campaign right now is it's in a position that the Trump campaign is not, to broaden its field of battle, to include places like Georgia and Texas and Arizona. And it's worth remembering, Elaine, when the Trump campaign was thinking about venues for a speech not in Charlotte, North Carolina, site of the Republican National Convention, where did it think about going? Georgia, Florida, and Arizona. It ended up going and choosing Jacksonville, Florida. But it's close to the Georgia media market, so that even tells you the Trump campaign knows that Georgia and Arizona are more up for play and competitive than they were in 2016, reinforcing the knowledge base that both parties have that they will be up for grabs.
Fascinating contest ahead. Major Garrett and Catherine Herridge, wonderful to end the week with you. Thanks very much. Take care.